So, hello again, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for participating in this webinar offered by the European School Education Platform, the European Commission's platform for school education in Europe. My name is Maria Elena, and I will be coordinating today's webinar. So, for this webinar, we have invited Dr. Colm Riley, who is the director of the Irish Centre for Talented Youth at Dublin City University. Dr. O'Reilly holds a strong background on the field of gifted and talented students education and has written multiple articles and presented papers at numerous conferences around Europe and worldwide. So today, along with Dr. O'Reilly, we will reflect on many areas like the stigma of giftedness and why gifted students want healthy social interactions with their peers. So before we begin, I would like to inform you that currently there is also an online course running on our platform. You can find the link of the course in the slide you are seeing right now. So you can click on the slide and save it for later. Also, towards the end of this webinar, we will share with you an evaluation form, which we would kindly invite you to fill in. And please feel free to share any thoughts and questions through the chat. The course opened on Monday, so after this webinar, you can take a look at it. Thank you again. And Colm, the floor is yours. You can start sharing your screen.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Colm O'Reilly. I'm the director of the Centre for Talented Youth at Dublin City University. And I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you about the social experiences of gifted students. Just in terms of my own background, as Maria Elena introduced me there, I've worked in this programme at Dublin City University for the past 30 years, working with various students between ages of 6 and 17. And I really can't overemphasize the importance of social experiences of gifted students. So many students come on programs at universities who have high ability and are really the most memorable experiences that they have is the ones that they share with their like-minded peers, and finding people who are interested in the same things as themselves and who have read similar books or who are interested in similar topics is a hugely beneficial thing for these students. And I think we're a little bit behind academically in relation to where we're at for what's happening, how we're doing research in this field, because we're mostly focusing on the academic experiences of the students, and we're mostly trying to affect outcomes that work relative to what these students can get out academically to improve their performance or to achieve to high potential, when we maybe should be looking a little bit more on their social experiences and how important this is, because the balance between them having positive social experiences greatly impacts on their academic experience. And also, hopefully from the purpose of this seminar, you will see that these students really value their social interactions and it has a huge impact on their learning. So I know that there's a lot of people participating in the course that the European Commission have put together, which I helped to work on previously on gifted and talented education, but I know it's an open format for others to join relative to this topic. So just to give you a very brief introduction into what we perceive gifted and talented students are, I have a definition there, which is gifted and talented students are those who are identified by professionally qualified people by virtue of outstanding abilities are capable of very high performance. And these are children who require differentiated educational programs beyond those provided by the regular school. And the problem really within the field of gifted education is that we don't really have a recognized definition of giftedness. And this has caused problems in relation to defining policy in the area and to for students themselves to avail of services. This definition from 1972 is probably the most widely used or variations of, because it kind of classifies high ability students as those who are capable of high performance and who require some level of differentiated education. And that can be through their general intellectual ability, through specific academic aptitude, maybe in leadership, could be in visual and performing arts, or also psychomotor ability. So that's the kind of definition that we're mostly using. So if you look at this normal distribution curve of intelligence, people are mostly familiar with normal curves. Intelligence is believed to perceive on the normal curve there. So if you're looking at the middle of that there, that's probably people who have an IQ of 100. So the IQ is supposedly normally distributed. So if you have an IQ of 100, then that's perceived as an average IQ. So if you look down on the left-hand side of that curve, then you obviously have people who are scoring much less than that. And then the highlighted piece that I've given there are people who are scoring much higher. So if you look at the curve, the nearer we get to the far right-hand side as you're looking, the higher the IQ score is. But when you think of interventions and what's being done relative to educational outcomes for students, most of them is focused on people who fall on the other side of the curve. So most interventions are for students who are struggling academically due to some form of possible learning difficulty or disability, and there's very little emphasis on students of high ability in relation to that. So what about like kind of definitions of gifted students that we have used or seen before? There's so many of them out there, and this is kind of causes a little bit of confusion in the field into how we define it, that sometimes people want this ex post facto definition. This person's made an outstanding contribution to society, therefore they're gifted. And then other people will look down at the very bottom and have this omnibus definition that they have the potential ability in a specified area to achieve. So these kind of definitions give us a kind of a better understanding of the field. Schools sometimes have to settle on ways of identifying these students so that they can achieve their potential. And this might be in a measurable IQ format, so they will just like take their IQ, and the people who score high ability in reasoning and judgment will then get opportunities beyond what the regular curriculum provides for them. But equally so, you may have students who are very creative and score very highly, or people who have kind of consistent high performance in socially valued activities. So how do we identify these students? Well, it's a bit of a contentious issue at the moment, because we mostly historically have used ability tests to identify these students. But we kind of find that like over the years, things like IQ tests have been questioned in terms of their bias and how fair they are, particularly for identifying students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, particularly identifying students who English may be their second language and stuff like that. So IQ tests, while valuable in identifying certain types of gifted students, are certainly not all-encompassing in that regard. Sometimes achievement tests in particular fields or area criterion-based tests that a student needs to have achieved a certain level are useful ways of identifying students. Sometimes students themselves will participate in competitions or various things, or have very high levels of output from a very young age that we can use that would be not in the norm of what we'd expect for a student of that age or in the category that they're in. Teachers, of course, are hugely helpful relative to identifying these students too. So teacher observations are also things that we use, and checklists and different variety of methods. So really what I kind of want to talk about today is the social experience of these students. And this is very connected to their lived experience. So if you look at this slide here, that the essence of being gifted somewhat makes them different to their peers. And these differences can be categorized in terms of their ability. We've just talked about identifying potential students who have learned faster than others. They understand stuff in more depth. They know certain specific content that they have an interest in, and they have a lot of knowledge about it. And sometimes these students exhibit uneven development in relation to that. And in that context, being gifted can also lead to differences in motivation. So it's quite regular to come across a gifted student who's highly motivated or interested in a topic that they know a lot about, like, say, computer programming being probably an easy example, that you can have students who teach themselves coding and then get really motivated and interested in high upskilling themselves in that regard. But then you might find that that student has a very low level of motivation in other subjects and other areas, and therefore their profile is quite uneven. So this is kind of different. So not all gifted students are very motivated at the same time. The other lived experience that's very common for these students is a lack of similar peers. And this obviously makes sense when we even think of the normal curve there, which we looked at a few slides ago. We were identifying students in the top, say, 5% of the population. There's not as many of those students as there would be in the middle of the curve, where they're all falling around the same level. So therefore, you might be in a school environment where you're the only gifted student there. And therefore, that can lead you to feelings of isolation or feeling very different to your peers relative to the knowledge that you have through no fault of your own in that context. And that is something that comes up regularly in research relative to working with social differences amongst these students, is that a lot of them have a lack of like-minded or similar peers. And visibility of differences, this is quite important because some students want to be very visible relative to their ability. So everybody would know that they're gifted and would understand or be aware of it. And then equally, there'll be a large number of students who really want to be invisible, and they certainly don't want other people to know that they're gifted, and they don't want to stand out from the crowd. And their lived experience is very different. And a lot of the time they're hiding their ability in that context. And I know that many people would be familiar with students who'd fall into that category. So Larry Coleman was a very influential researcher in this area, and he kind of said that being different, he adapted a statement by Irving Goffman here, who I've written about. Being different is problematic in that differentness prevents or at least interferes with social acceptance and personal development. And this is quite interesting because this is kind of what brought about the stigma of gifted paradigm, which Coleman and Cross developed together in 1998. And what they said, which is very natural and interesting, and it's definitely something we'll all identify with, but it also shows where the problems can occur, is that basically gifted and talented students want normal social interactions, but they learn through experience that people treat them differently when they become aware of their giftedness. And then they furthered this on by saying, well, gifted and talented students can now influence how others interact with them by manipulating the information others have about them through various coping strategies. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, obviously, the normal social interaction thing is pretty easily to explain. You know, most people just want a happy, normal social life. Then they find that when people are aware of being gifted, they suddenly, this kind of lived experience of difference attaches itself. And then we talked a little bit there about visibility and invisibility. And the talented and gifted students then discovered, well, they could manipulate these social environments to create these normal social interactions by either telling people all how gifted they are or hiding how gifted they are, depending on the circumstance and the situation. And we'll go through a couple of examples of that now. So if you look at this information management module, you have this child and they're going into various different environments. And when they do that, they will have different levels of social expectations within that. And if they go in and find that they feel different because of the social situation that's occurred, that people are treating them differently, then they'll continue on from A to B and B to C by managing their information they have about themselves. And if they don't feel different, then they won't feel they need to manage it. So some people will manage this information and better relative to the social situation, and other people won't have strategies relative to that. So if you look at this continuum of disability, we talked a little bit about it there, which was high visibility, which was everybody being aware of it, invisibility, which was hiding it so that people are not aware of it, and then Coleman and Cross added in another area, which was disidentifying altogether. And that would be acting completely in contrast to what you would expect a gifted student to do. So the high visibility students would be ones who have maybe had their high academic ability announced to their peers, and they have to deal with that. The invisibility may be like, say, students who might be very talented athletes, but secretly are scholars as well, but don't really push or talk about the fact that they're very studious and people prefer to be recognized for their athletic prowess. And the disidentifying ones would be ones who would try and like underachieve deliberately, do badly, not participate in academic activities, and basically ignore their ability to the point that they want other people not to perceive them as gifted at all. So over time, Coleman and Cross then developed some strategies for how to measure this information management that the students participate in. And they had three kind of scenarios that they created relative to that. The first one was, if you see there, the word onomatopoeia, which is quite a difficult word to spell. And they used this as a test as to if gifted students knew how to spell this word, would they be open and say they were able to spell it easily, or would they hide the fact that they're very good at spelling and able to spell this word? But it's quite a low threat being able to spell a certain word. If you're identified for being a good speller, it's not something that's going to be, categorically different relative to that. The other example they did was a substitute teacher. So they used an example where students has had a substitute teacher, and as often may happen in this situation, some students didn't behave well while the substitute teacher was there because it wasn't their regular teacher and were acting out, whereas gifted students might want to still work as hard as they normally do. And would they do this with the substitute teacher there, or would they act out and misbehave with their friends? So that was perceived as a moderate threat. And the last one was the biology exam. And the biology exam was quite an interesting one, which was evidence of studying for a certain exam and how well this would go down with your peers. And we'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. So if we take the setting of the biology exam, we'll look in the cafeteria line, several people are discussing life science exam. Tracy said wasn't that test impossible? I must have spent 10 minutes trying to think of examples of major biomes. Chris, I blew the whole thing, even though I studied really hard. Marty, I probably failed it too. Marty said to John, I bet you breezed through this test. You didn't even open a book to study. Actually, John had spent several hours studying and he thought it wasn't a difficult test. But what would John be most inclined to say in that situation? And the Coleman and Cross came through a kind of a research with over 1,500 students. They came up with 5 different scenarios that the students would come up with. And some told the truth and said, oh, well, actually, I thought it was kind of easy. Some said, I probably studied as hard as you could, but the test wasn't too hard. So these were placating. Others would kind of cop out. How long did you study? So they didn't even mention what they were asked about. They just changed the subject. Some covered up and said, oh, tests can be hard sometimes, even though they weren't that hard. And some will just out and out lie and say, John would say, oh, well, actually, the exam was very difficult and it was a pain to do. So we looked at that. And what happened was that we found that, like, it was quite interesting. The original, this is a kind of a study which we replicated in Ireland a couple of years ago. The original study was in the 1980s for American students, and we replicated with Ireland, and as you can see, there was pretty similar results, but not even gratifyingly improved scenarios over the last 25, 30 years. Like, only about 20% of people would actually have told the truth in that situation and said that they thought the exam was easy. A good number of people would placate and say, I probably studied as hard as you did, but the test wasn't too hard. But I think the interesting bar and graph there is the lie scenario, is that in the original study, 12% of people, the American students, said they would lie and say, they said, well, I thought the exam was difficult as well, even though they didn't find it difficult. And then we find when we replicated with the Irish students, it actually had gone up, not down, and 28% of the Irish students felt they would lie rather than say they studied hard for an exam and did well. And this is a very good example of students trying to manipulate social experiences to give people other perceptions of them. So they don't want people to know that they were studious and diligent and worked hard. They prefer to get their peer acceptance by either lying to them or copping out or covering up rather than telling the truth. And this is quite interesting as a social interaction, because we've already established that they kind of want normal social interactions, but feel in order to do that, they have to placate or lie to their peers to achieve that. So that was quite interesting. So I'll talk about a second study that we did there quite recently, which was a cross-cultural experience of the social experience of gifted students. And again, it's a pretty easy study to follow. I don't know if I've referenced it there, but if anyone wants the where we published it, it was in the Roper Review. I think I can send you on a link and you can have a read of it if you ever want to have a look at the study. So we looked at 5 countries. There was 90 students, 45 males and 45 females from various countries across the world, the United Kingdom and Ireland and France, the United States, and some students in Korea. And the students were kind of balanced between elementary school, age 8 to 10, middle school, 11 to 14, and high school students, 15 to 18. And we found some interesting findings relative to this. We found with their, there's where the article is referenced. Sorry, I knew I had mentioned it somewhere, so that's good. It was in the Roper Review in 2019. So this was quite interesting. All of the countries, all of the students were very aware of other people's expectations. And this wasn't necessarily a positive thing. What they perceived was that other people expected them to do well, and, you know, were very kind of, could be, you know, they quite verbal or vocal about the fact that other people expected them to be perfect all the time. And that this, again, led to the second thing that came up quite regularly for all the students, is feeling under a lot of pressure. And I think that this is something that we don't normally perceive or think about relative to gifted students, is that sometimes they're put under a lot of undue pressure by their parents, by their teachers, by their peers. Sometimes they put pressure on themselves to achieve. And we found that that was interesting relative to that all the countries felt the social experiences that they had was pressure to achieve. The other one as well, which was quite interesting, that all the students from the various countries had, was they felt concerned for their peers' feelings, that they were worried that if they were doing very well in tests, that their peers would feel bad because they didn't do as well as them. And this was kind of, again, going back to students in schools where they may be the only gifted student, or where they can feel quite isolated, that they want to have normal social interactions with the people in their class, but they're achieving far better than them in tests and in various academic areas. And they felt that this disrupted their relationship with their peers outside of class, because they were concerned that their peers didn't do as well as them and would think differently of them because of that. And this kind of ties into the next one, which they all said they were quite comforted by having gifted peers. So again, as I said back at the very start, when I was talking about students who came on our Irish program and really had very positive social experiences because they made friends, maybe for the first time, or because they met like-minded peers, or because for the first time in their life, they didn't feel as though they had to hide their ability and that they could be themselves. So a lot of the social experiences that we found these students had were very comforted when they had gifted peers to run ideas by, and didn't have to feel under pressure to achieve as much with them than they might with their non-gifted peers. They were also like somewhat confused by their peers' responses. Some said sometimes their peers would make fun of them for doing well, and then other times their peers would copy their answers to do as well as that. And they couldn't really, a lot of the students in the study found they couldn't understand why their peers didn't want to learn as much as they did. So the negative connotations of this are kind of highlighted on the right-hand side here. A lot of them experience rejection from their peers because of this, because of their giftedness. They felt excluded from social activities, excluded from being friends with other people, because they were set out as being different because they were gifted. And they were highly aware of their visibility. So if the test results were called out by the teacher, or if they received an academic award, or if there was something that put them in a category that other people became aware that they were gifted, that put them in a vulnerable situation, which often led to other peers having jealousy of their achievements and of them, other people not wanting them to do well. And as we found in 3 of the countries, quite commonly, very few said they had very few close friends, that they felt that like their friends that they had were not as intimate and as close as they could have been, because they felt they were a lot of the time worried that their friends were a little bit jealous of them, or they were worried that they were going to hurt their feelings by doing well, and they were worried that ultimately they may get rejected by them because of their giftedness. So that just kind of highlights the various countries thing, but a lot of them were pretty consistent in relation to that, and that's kind of highlighted in the article. And I think that this is quite interesting. Some of these quotes were interesting relative to what they said. Awareness of other people's expectations. One student from the UK said, well, before exams, people will be saying, oh, you're expected to get high marks. You don't need to work. And that's quite difficult sometimes to deal with. And if you look at the pressure, what the US student said there, the other kids look up to you and they put pressure on you. Like if you don't do as well, they will be like, they won't see you as smart as you really are. And I think that that's quite interesting. Both of those things about being other people expect them to do well all the time can put a lot of pressure on them. And then they're always sometimes put up there to fail because other people don't want them to do, they perceive, as well as they do all the time. And I think it's sometimes, I recall talking to a student who was telling me a story about feedback that they were getting from a teacher. And they said they went into the class and the teacher was doing, it was a history class, and said, oh, John, you got 62%. Well done, John. Mary, you got 77%. Mary, you're doing really well. Anthony, you got 99%. Anthony, we expected that from you. And if you kind of think about that, you know, the feedback that Anthony got there, even though he did better than the other two students, was very negative and was very much, you know, related to, well, that's what we thought you were going to do. And that put, again, a lot of pressure on that student. And I remember him saying, well, you know, I was very worried that if I did another test and I got 98, the teacher would tell me, oh, you're not doing as well, you're slipping, you got 99 the last time. So these are things to kind of think about relative to the social experience that a lot of these students have. The other thing was kind of concern for peers' feelings. If, like, and this was a French student, if your friends have been revising as much of you, but they didn't get the results that was as good as yours, you feel like you don't want to brag about it or boast about it. So you say something that won't make them feel bad about themselves. Or the Korean parent said, my friend's mother keeps comparing her, saying things like, if she was here right now while you're laying around, I don't want our friendship to get awkward. I wish they wouldn't compare me. I hate when I get compared with my peers because it hurts their feelings. And I think that that was quite interesting. Again, we talked about comfort with gifted peers. And this is actually an Irish student who had experienced a program at our university with novel writing with other gifted students. My first class in novel writing, we were discussing Ulysses, what was wrong with Twilight. It was crazy. Everyone had similar interests to me, and I fitted in very quickly. And then the other one about this theme that came up was confused by peer responses. That other peers, non-gifted peers, might say, sometimes they make a bit of fun of me because I always know the answer. And this is interesting. It's not just me, though. They make fun of people who don't know any answers. It doesn't make sense, really. And I think that this is kind of one of the common dilemmas that a lot of gifted students have. They just don't really understand their friends' reactions to various things that happen relative to their ability. And sometimes we need to kind of educate them better on coping better in these situations. And that's something that we'll talk about near the end. So that was just the country and the rejection. Okay. So the stigma of giftedness themes, rejection by peers came up quite commonly. My friend asked me for an answer and during a test, and I tell her I can't because it's a test, and sometimes she won't play with me anymore. And that was an Irish student. And again, this is quite difficult for them to experience or go through. Aware of visibility. I'm like saying things, if it makes me feel self-conscious, I feel as though they're thinking of me as some type of nerd. So that's and then jealousy. Kids who are not good at academics and jealous of me, sometimes they say, I wish I was you for a day in my lifetime. And again, back to this few close friends thing, they just have me around for a laugh over a random fact. I don't have any close friends I could talk to. I'm almost comedic to them. They just find me to a bit of a laugh. So that's kind of interesting. So the social coping themes were hiding. And there was a thing about hiding their ability. I don't want to make them jealous, so I try not to celebrate too much around me. My English teacher, because I'm good at essays, keeps pointing it out to the class, and I've started not completing my homework because she always reads out mine. And that's interesting. That combines a lot of this social stigma of giftedness, that the teacher is using this student's work as an example of something good, but that student doesn't want their peers to think of them as the example that should be used all the time, and in this instance is not actually completing their assignments so that that won't happen again. So deliberately underachieving or hiding to not have to deal with the social stigma of giftedness. And then conformity. And then it's like, I like to dumb it down a bit to hang out with my friends. When kids were saying the exam was hard, I say it was too hard, even if it was easy. I try to get along with friends first. So a lot of them are hiding their ability to fit in. And I think that that's quite common in, like, say, these situations that we've talked about there. And even sometimes that can happen a lot, like in situations where you have kids starting school. And in that instance, they may be a child with a very extended vocabulary, and they may kind of come into a situation with other students, and they're talking with the language that they'd normally use at home, and the people in their class or the other students don't understand them. And therefore, then that student is automatically isolated because their vocabulary is too extended. And normally what happens, there's two things that can happen. Sometimes students will just go, oh, I'll just dumb down my language and talk in a way that the students understand. Or the student who can't do that is going to find themselves increasingly isolated and having very few peers and very few people to be friends with. Okay. So in terms of this is quite interesting, related to social experience of giftedness over time. And we found that this is kind of something that I wasn't surprised at all to find it in the research, and it's again something that, like, practically I'd have been quite aware from my own experience of working with these students, is that the younger the child tends to be very proud and happy about the fact that they're smart and bright if they're identified early. And they're surprised and probably don't fully understand their peer rejection. Whereas by middle school, like 10 to 12, they're starting to become aware of the difficulties associated with being identified as gifted, the high expectations, the jealousy from their peers, and the possible rejection. And then by high school at 15, 16, we found that a lot of the students are more aware now of what these difficulties are, and they've learned to deal with them. But I think therein lies a problem, because if you look at this slide here, a lot of those students in middle school, when they start becoming aware of the difficulties of the expectations and the jealousy and the possible rejection, that is the time when they kind of opt out or decide themselves, oh, I'm going to disidentify with being gifted. I'm just not going to be that person anymore. And they don't really make it to the high school gifted category where you become much more comfortable with who you are. They're more saying, gosh, this is too difficult to cope and deal with at this particular period of time. So therefore, I'll just kind of withdraw from academic experiences. And that's quite common. And that's why there's probably less high school gifted students than there is at middle school, because these students have been put off by the negative connotations that this brings them. So the last study that I'll talk about was a social experiences of gifted students scale. And it's quite interesting. We created this instrument from what we learned in the cross-cultural study. And it asked how frequently social experiences has happened to them and how it made them feel. And we did it with about 500 Irish secondary school students, and we had some interesting findings. The kind of 7 that came up the most were this top of the class. Most of them said I performed better than other students in schoolwork. A very common one then was adult expectations. My parents expected me to get everything right. Pressure to achieve. I felt pressure from others to get everything right. Helping expectations. Other students expected me to help them because I knew more than they did. Hiding. I tried to hide my academic abilities so others wouldn't treat me differently. More serious. I was confused by other students trying to get out of schoolwork because these students were too serious of their own work that they wouldn't understand why people would do that. And peer rejection. I was unable to connect with other students because I was too different. So let's see what the kind of actual findings were. So with these students, we found that if you look at this kind of way we did this slide here, was that what happened the most frequently was that they perceived themselves to be top of the class, and that is a general feeling that they felt positive about. Whereas if you see the next one, which came up the most frequently, was pressure, being under pressure to achieve. And if you look on the second slide, pressure to achieve was something that made them feel the worst about themselves. So this is kind of interesting that that led to very negative feelings with them, that they always felt under pressure to achieve. And also adults expected them to achieve. And by that, they put in their teachers and their parents, and that they frequently expected them to do very well. But that didn't make them feel very good about themselves, the students. And this is something that's kind of common in relation to social experiences. Pressure to achieve and adult expectations of doing well all the time, which they found was very hard to live up to in every context. So what we actually did next was, I was talking to a couple of my collaborators, Professor Tracy Cross and Jennifer Cross, particularly in the College of William and Mary. Tracy Cross was one of the ones who had designed the stigma of gifted theory with Larry Coleman. And I said, you know, we're constantly producing some interesting, hopefully, academic work on highlighting the social experiences of these students and showing that, like, it's not as simple as we perceive it to be, and that sometimes these students can have very negative experiences from their peers, from their teachers. They can feel under pressure from their parents. But I said, there's very little resources out there that help these students to deal with these things. There's a lot of academic papers that reiterate the same thing again, but are we actually doing anything that we can help these students to cope with and deal with? So we actually, over last year, we put together this resource guide. It's actually a free guide. I'm pretty sure if you're doing the course, it's included somewhere in it. I remember putting it on. But if you don't have a copy, or if you'd like one, just, I'm sure if you have my details, I'm sure they'll come up at the end of this. Send me an email and I can send you a copy, because it's quite an interesting one. And what we did was we did this resource guide where we talked to the students and said, like, you know, if you're feeling under pressure, you need to communicate with your parents that you're feeling under pressure. But we also then, for the resource guide, we gave some advice to parents to say, like, be more open in your communication with your child about their expectations, because we've said they feel under pressure to achieve. And by being open, you mean you need to listen to your child when they're communicating with you that they feel under pressure a good bit. And teachers, we kind of ask them to be more aware that the gifted students may internalize expectations to the point of distress. So you need to kind of constantly stay in communication with them about their workloads, their timelines, and their priorities. And finally, we talked a little bit, our guided administrators and policymakers, to kind of, I think a lot of policy documents for gifted students are very academically focused, when I think we've discovered, and hopefully from these type of talks, or hopefully from understanding stuff a bit better, that social experiences are very important as well, and should be included in any kind of guidelines or documents that administrators put together for gifted students. The social side of things, what we said to students was, while it might be tempting to hide your abilities or underachieve to not making others jealous or hurting their feelings, there's negative consequences to this. And then I think a better approach, we said, would be to learn strategies for when you care about the person, you can outperform. And we also talked a little bit about how to learn and make and keep friends. And I think that a lot of these students, you know, hadn't really learned that before, or just kind of perceived that as being a natural thing. And we talked about helping strategies to make them feel better about themselves, and also being nice to others so that they don't feel as though they're, you know, being better than them all the time. So I'm just at the close there. I think I'm about a minute or two early, but hopefully then I might be able to answer a couple of questions.
Thank you very much, Colm. So we have some time. If there are any questions, please post them now in the chat. I would like to read a comment that Athanasia made. Support of these students to deal with their difficulties effectively is often not of high priority at our middle schools, where support of special learning needs and difficulties is. I think she's asking if, not she's asking, she's proposing that any findings of surveys on schools' policies or teachers' practices would be something very interesting to have it.
Yeah, totally agree with that. I think that the more information we have out there, and the more that we highlight this social experiences, the more people will understand it better, because they're similar to social experiences of other people. And I think that sometimes we just put gifted students in academic frameworks and don't think about their social experiences.
And I would like to ask something from my side. Basically, we focused on the challenges that gifted students face, but what about the teachers? Because I believe that teachers also face some challenges when they have to work with gifted and talented students. Do you have any input of that? Maybe a few comments?
Yes, I think that First of all, definitely it's a difficult situation for teachers currently because there's so many different abilities within particular classes that they have to be able to cope with these various learning challenges that students might have, difficulties that students might have outside of school, difficulties with the curriculum and different things. So there's a lot of challenges to put together. But I think the most important thing is to raise awareness with teachers of, because some of them definitely don't perceive that the messages that they give to students by highlighting their work and reading it out can have negative effects on that student in relation to how their peers perceive them to do. Also, highlighting their result, but not, either A, overpraising them, or B, underpraising them, is also not helpful because it's sending mixed messages to that particular student. So I think that maybe it's just that the teachers need to be a little bit more aware of these kind of social stigmas of giftedness, rather than perceiving it that, oh, everybody will be so happy that that child has been told they're gifted and that everybody will do well, whereas the research is actually showing some people are not very happy with it and are quite jealous about it. So I think that there needs to be a little bit more discretion relative to these things. But definitely, to me, the most effective one that we've found is the possibility for them to work with like-minded peers. That seems to have the most positive social impact.
Great, thank you so much. So we have another question here. For focused programs such as CTYI, are there any of these social strategies integrated into the various subjects?
Yes, that's a very good question. Sometimes this is something that I'm definitely more learning as we go along, So say at secondary school, what I try to do is we try and run programs where there's designated social time outside of class, where the students can do stuff that they're interested in themselves and make friends much easier based on their interests and stuff. What I find with the primary school is that that's more difficult because they're younger and it's harder to motivate them to make friends as easily with people who they may not know as well. So we usually do that by like putting them in, if they like science, that they would all be in a class where they're learning, veterinary science together, and that therefore the curriculum that they're covering is something that they all like and are interested in. So that encourages a kind of a social friendship within these particular students. So they learn and become friends without us having to kind of make it known that this is an activity for you to become friends. It just is more natural. Whereas we do find that as they get older, they want to pursue that themselves. So we just have to facilitate and put things in place for them to do that. But that's a very good question.
Thank you very much. So one last question I see here, if you can maybe propose some strategies that are used to make those students more social.
Oh, yes, that's a good question. I think that this is something that is sometimes it's a case by case basis. Okay, so like I suppose like there's two trains of thought relative to this. Okay, so this would be a very common thing amongst students who are, say, very good at technology. Okay, and a lot of people know these things, and the problem, like, say, with kids who are very good at technology, is that they never want to get off technology and they just want to be on technology all the time and they don't want to talk to anyone because they're obsessed with technology. But we need to have them interacting with other people, so we need to have more open project work that they can work with other people on relative to their technology, rather than them just moving at working by themselves. We need to have more kind of interactive, non group related projects, but it is important that these students have are working with people at a similar level to themselves. And then the other thing to do is just like to encourage them to try other things that they may not be as good at as they would be academically, so that they can definitely see and understand why, if they're brilliant at maths and some kids are struggling with it, that maybe if they're trying a musical instrument or sport and they're not doing as well in it, it's good for them to see that other people, that the struggles that other people may have academically that they don't have, and this gives them a better understanding of what other people are going through. We do find that that's an effective method.
Great, thank you very much. Basically, if you want to learn more about this topic, there is a course, an online course running at this moment. It started on Monday. Once again, you can find it if you click on the link supporting gifted students on the slide you can see right now. You can find more information there. You can still enroll and take part in this course. I will read one last comment before we close our session. So, I have always looked for covering the classroom strategies rather than the social aspect of the giftedness, which is very complicated and needs a very specific and individual approach to it. I would really be very grateful to have the possibility within the resource guide. So maybe we could share the resource guide on the webinars page. We will share the link with you once the webinar recording is uploaded and along with the presentation. So I would like to take 1 minute to ask you to fill in our survey. I hope you liked this webinar, and for me personally, it was very interesting. I learned many new things. Thank you very much, Colm, for doing this presentation and working with us in this webinar.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for participating. We hope to see you in the next webinar from the ESEP platform. Have a nice day.